Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, foreign policy, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. In this week's episode, we're sitting down with Cleo Paskal, Senior Fellow at the Conference of Defense Associations Institute and non-resident Senior Fellow for the Indo-Pacific at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. We discuss the ramifications of China's coercive influence in Pacific Island nations, how Canada and the US fare in engaging with their Indo-Pacific allies to counter China's political warfare, and what developments to watch for closely amidst the rapidly evolving dynamics of the region. This is the Expert Series. Thank you very much, Cleo, for joining us on the Expert Series today.
Great pleasure, sir. I'm so excited I cut you off. Go ahead.
Not to worry. So I'll just dive right in here. In your recent publication, The Diplomat on U.S. policy in the Pacific Islands, you wrote about how the U.S., at least in the political sphere, hasn't really woken up to how Beijing-fueled corruption is eroding countries from the inside. And I was wondering, could you provide insight into whether Canada is faring much better in our relationships with Pacific Island nations?
Sure. So yeah, and just to clarify, I think there are a lot of people in the U.S. who do understand what's going on, and including in the State Department and definitely in the Department of Defense. And there's an understanding of the importance of it. It's just a variation, I'd say, on urgency. And to give an example, because it'll relate to what Canada is doing or not doing, you have a situation, for example, the Solomon Islands, where the PRC has signed a security deal with the government of the Solomon Islands that will allow, with the pro-PRC Prime Minister's approval, to deploy PLA troops in Solomon Islands to secure Chinese major infrastructure and to keep PRC citizens safe and put down civil dissent. It's pretty extreme. And so the U.S. opened up an embassy. This is the site of the Battle of Guadalcanal, but they had closed the embassy a couple decades ago, reopened it. But the embassy has very limited staff and no consular services. So you have a situation where, for example, there's a doctor at the hospital there who just got a scholarship. He's a hand surgeon to study more advanced techniques in the US. But for him to take up that scholarship, he has to pay for himself to fly to Papua New Guinea to apply to the US Embassy in Papua New Guinea for the visa to go to the US, something which he can't afford. Meanwhile, the PRC has doctors in the hospital, and they sent the Peace Ark into port, that's their hospital ship, to collect DNA, but basically to they say to deliver medical services, which they're delivering medical services, but at the same time they have their own influence operations. So that just gives you an idea of the mismatch between what the U.S. is doing in what's considered a very sensitive, important location and what China is doing. And Canada is not on that map at all. There's nothing, Canada's not there at all. And there's a lot that Canada can be doing. And I think GAC wants to, and I think they're increasing their focus on the area. And Canada has political warfare has a lot of negative connotations to it. But basically, it has the tools to build those relationships in a much stronger way, and in a uniquely Canadian way. Like there's one project that's being done with using lessons learned in Canadian First Nations communities in Vanuatu around traditional medicine and commercialization of that and those sorts of things. Those are things that are uniquely Canadian innovations that could really help with the human security, which would make that political warfare outreach from the PRC much less effective. So I think, like in the US, there's more awareness, but I'm not sure the people who are trying to do it are getting the resources or the staff or the political will behind what needs to be done in order to make it truly effective.
So in the context of the Indo-Pacific strategy, like you say, there's more awareness of what's going on, but how much lag time do you think there is before we start seeing some material action follow? And what strategies are available to address that?
So, Canada is doing things here and there. We have unbelievably limited resources dedicated to this. We have expertise, we have innovation, but we don't have embassies or high commissions in a lot of locations. We haven't focused around business to business engagement. An interesting thing about the Solomon Islands, again, just because it's useful to go back to one case study to see how you fare. That same Solomon Islander doctor who would require who has to fly to PNG to get the visa to go to the US, can actually enter Canada without a visa. Canada allows Solomon Islanders as tourists to come into Canada without a visa, but there's no building on those sort of entry points. The same with the French possessions in the Pacific Islands, French Polynesia, New Caledonia. The citizens of France can study in Quebec graduate degrees for the same fees as Quebecers, quite low. So, we could be building up those sorts of relationships, getting young French Polynesians and New Caledonians to study in Quebec, to create those linkages that you create when you're in your early 20s that you can then carry on throughout your career. There are other parts of the Indo-Pacific, there are other unique types of relationships. The relationships with India are complex, and there's some negative parts, but there are a lot of positive parts that could be built on. So you really need to figure out where Canada's unique leverage points are, and realize that the countries of the Indo-Pacific have a lot of people knocking on their door right now. And, they're not doing Canada, a favor by privileging us or, kind of making us front of the list for engagement. We really have to make that effort if we take it seriously and adapt it to each individual country in the context of developing a wider Indo-Pacific strategy that is built from the ground up, and so it's more stable and cohesive and sustainable.
Speaking on that point of Canada's relationships with countries in the Indo-Pacific region, there have been criticisms from several countries that Canada has been inconsistent with its engagement, somewhat of a fair weather friend. Can you provide insight on those criticisms? And are we moving substantially in the right direction now?
Well, they're right. Canada, might show some interest and then might not, and then something happens, and then, for domestic political reason, Canada throws a fit, and then, they're completely right. Again, our strategies are at this point so unanchored in a long-term foundation that, like, an individual in an office can make a huge difference. You get the right person in a high commission or an embassy, and they can make an enormous difference, positive, or if it's the wrong person, negative. That's not ideal. So they're right, and I think Ottawa being Ottawa, it is just not geographically close. It's a similar problem with Washington. Its physical location is a remnant of the Atlantic century, of the 19th and early 20th century. And so walking around Ottawa, you don't see how the Indo-Pacific is part of Canada as you would if you're in Vancouver, for example. And so you don't get that sense of urgency. You don't get the sense of rate of change. And you also don't feel insecure as you would if you're in a location that is in missile range of one of the Chinese missiles. I mean, the US, there's the Guam killer missile. The Chinese call it the Guam killer missile. That, gets attention if you're in the US. They haven't publicly talked about their Vancouver killer missile. But they can range Canada, and it's not that they will, but it's just in the context of understanding why there's this lack of urgency, which means a lack of resources and a lack of cohesion. It's kind of basic, but I think part of it is if you're sitting in GAC in Gatineau or Ottawa, you don't feel it like you would if you're in Hawaii, for example, or Tokyo or Manila. And that's been reflected in some of the policies that have been made at the top political levels.
Expanding a bit more on China's actions in the region, you've written and you've talked a little bit already about it, on how China exploits opportunities to influence and interfere in Pacific Island nations. You wrote recently specifically what that looks like in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, as well as the Solomon Islands. And I was wondering, could you give a brief treatment of what tactics and strategies China employs and what that spells for the region more broadly?
Sure. So the best thing written on this was a letter written by the former president of the Federated States of Micronesia, a man called David Penuelo, which came out in March. He's no longer president, but he just on September 6th came up with a follow-up to that letter, which details what's happened since March, where he talks about, as the president of a country, what he saw happening in his country. And this is a country that recognizes China, but has a very close defense relationship with the US. And the goal, it's in the middle of the Central Pacific. And we talk a lot about the first island chain and the second island chain, which are these kind of strings of islands, which first island chain is Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Malaysia, that kind of hem in the Chinese, especially Navy. And China's pushing up against them with the construction of the South China Sea, how important those are from a Western defense architecture perspective. But those defenses, first island chain, second island chain, the treaty allies in Japan and the Philippines, are only possible because the US has this unique relationship with three countries in the Central Pacific, Palau, Marshall Islands, and Federated States of Micronesia, which gives the US unlimited defense rights over their land, air, and water, effectively unlimited, which means that they can roam this corridor of freedom from Hawaii all the way to the Philippines, all the way across. So Penuelo is the president of the middle one, of the three, the Federated States of Micronesia, very large ocean territory. And he was describing these influence operations that were designed, he thinks, to essentially neutralize or weaken FSM in the case of an attack on Taiwan, to make them pull them away from the US and make it much more difficult for the US to deploy. This is a location that knew a lot of battles during World War II. The Battle of Truk was here, for example. And so he described the backing of separatist organizations to create social fragmentation, to weaken the state, the bypassing of the federal government in things like who represents FSM at an international meeting. So China had an international meeting, and the president didn't want to send anybody, and China itself chose an FSM citizen to represent FSM at this meeting. Enormous amounts of bribery, corruption. He would put in place a policy that would then not be enacted because whatever ministry that was had been compromised by China. So essentially this kind of entropic warfare where you create fragmentation and chaos within the state and make it very difficult to operate. It's very unusual to get the sitting president of a country, describe what's happening in his country. That's why that letter is remarkable. And the follow-up, which just came out, says not only has that not stopped, that's accelerated since he left office. And you can see echoes of that in many, many other countries across the entire Indo-Pacific.
Bearing all that in mind, then, what can be done either by Pacific Island nations or in concert with partners and allies elsewhere to bolster the ability of Pacific Islands to counter China's political and military aggression?
So the entry point, China comes in with usually with an economic front. So it comes in on multiple planes, but two important ones are the first one is they'll find a country in need of economic development, and these countries, especially because they're recovering from COVID, the economic disaster of COVID, combined with high fuel prices resulting from the war in Ukraine and other factors, they're at the end of a very long supply chain. They're economically weak. So China will come in and say, we'll invest or do X, Y, or Z, or bring in our tourists and things like that. So one level is to create economic options for these countries. And they have resources, fisheries, things like that, that have the potential to sustain them economically. The other thing is this incredible amount of corruption. So, I mentioned there's this braided approach with the commercial, the strategic, and the criminal activity. You go after the criminal activity, that's the weak point. And we're supposed to do that anyways. We're supposed to be pro transparency, accountability, all that sort of stuff. And a lot of the Chinese money, that bribe money that goes to somebody like a Sogavari, for example, the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands, will be laundered through Australian or New Zealand banks or real estates, things like that. So right now, there is no downside to taking Chinese money. You never hear about a politician being punished for taking Chinese money. There's no loss of assets, no loss of position, no loss of freedom, no loss of visa access. So if you're doing a cost benefit analysis and you don't care about selling out your country, why wouldn't you take the Chinese money? So there needs to be what I think of as block and build. You need to block the malign activity while you're building the economic sustainability. And you can't do one without the other. Whatever you try to build, China will see as a threat to the Chinese position, and so will try to destroy it. So you need to be able to block in order to be able to build. You need to put a security, political warfare security perimeter around the garden that you're trying to grow. Otherwise, you won't be able to grow it.
Does that also encompass or include some kind of physical security component then?
So there's the other part of that is that there's an enormous amount of Chinese organized crime that comes along with all of this stuff. So I'm not actually a huge fan of building up the policing component, because there in many cases there actually isn't that much murders in a place like Solomon Islands, but what you need are investigators, lawyers, the equivalent of district attorneys. And you talk to somebody like the Attorney General of Palau, and she'll say, I know there's a huge amount of corruption going on in my country. I want to clean it up, but I can't find any lawyers to come and work in Palau. Right. So it's a set of tools that you might not think of initially, but are really essential. The governor of Northern Marianas, who's been fighting this incredible political warfare assault, which has included a casino that was running billions a month through his country, Chinese casino, more than the casinos in Macau. What they got in a new governor, and he wants to clean up his government, and he's begging practically the US federal government to send in a district attorney, FBI agents, forensic accountants. We're fighting on a political warfare battlefield, so we need the political warfare tools now. At the same time, though, China's not stopping its military buildup, its kinetic buildup. That's what you're talking about. So you also need to, bolster that and create a situation where, again, the cost benefit analysis in Beijing is altered so that it doesn't think that it would be an easy win, and it might affect their decision making, especially around something like Taiwan.
The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is preparing to make Canada its latest strategic partner. Do you think this will have any material impact on security in the region?
ASEAN is also just signing a deal with the Pacific Island Forum. You need to engage with ASEAN because the individual member countries of ASEAN find it important. But ASEAN is only as strong as its weakest members, and it has a few very, very weak members who act as proxies for the PRC in the context of ASEAN negotiations. I would expect Canada coming in and attending ASEAN meetings is great, But what will probably come out of it that would actually be efficient is more the side meetings, the bilateral meetings, and getting a sense of which countries are really far down the PRC influence path and which countries are trying to break away. Like the Philippines is doing incredible work around its transparency initiative, where it is actually showing video of what the Chinese ships are doing to the Filipino ships. So being in the room helps in that way and helps build relationships and trust and things like that. But direct ASEAN Canada initiatives that help in a larger security perspective may not be imminently forthcoming. How's that problematic?
Well put. So speaking a little bit about another partnership in the region, there's been quite a bit of hay made about Canada being left out of AUKUS. And I was wondering, does this really indicate a substantial security disadvantage, or does it represent an opportunity for Canada to pursue and deepen other partnerships that we haven't typically prioritized?
So what they say is there are going to be multiple phases of AUKUS, and I would take it as a good moment for self-reflection about why Canada is not trusted as a partner in that way. So instead of kind of immediately jumping on to the next thing, I'm not sure we needed to be included, but the reason why we definitely wouldn't have been included, I think, is because Canada is perceived as heavily penetrated and not a reliable security partner for what are the crown jewels of defense technology. So, whereas Australia, which has its own issues with PRC penetration, publicly known, was considered appropriate. Now, again, I'm not sure it's something that any side would have wanted. I'm not sure we want nuclear submarines. We can afford them. I don't know. But regardless, I don't think we would have even gotten out of the gate because of the perception of how secure Canada is or isn't. And that's something that we shouldn't just move on to the next thing. We should use it as an excuse to talk about publicly, think about, and be open about it, because our New Zealand also wasn't included, and it's also known to be quite heavily penetrated. And if we think that's a problem, then now's a good time to talk about all that.
So you've given us a broad overview and unpacked some significant developments, and it's been fantastic. I just wanted to open up the floor to you. Is there anything we haven't touched on yet that you think is really important to bring up for our audience? Any last insights that you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, well, if you're looking at timelines, so I mentioned the three U.S. freely associated states: Palau, Micronesia, Federated Republic of Marshall Islands. They go across the middle. They go from Hawaii to Philippines. Their compacts of free association with the U.S. have a financial component that's renewed every 20 years. And we are in that renewal cycle now. The renewal is going to U.S. Congress. And if it's not renewed by the 30th of September, 2023, they fall off a financial cliff. And that includes for everything from the postal service to the weather service to school programs to, it is a major thing. And it creates a sense of insecurity in the countries that is a perfect opening for PRC political warfare to say, look, the Americans aren't giving you this consistent funding. If you were part of us, we would make sure that everything was fine. And at the same time, they're paying off a few of the decision makers to make sure that they are personally fine. And you have an election coming up in one of the three, the Marshall Islands, in November, where this may be an issue. And you have another one in Palau coming up next year, which may be an issue. So, from a Western defense architecture perspective, the assumption has been that those three U.S. freely associated states, this corridor of freedom, is secure. I'd recommend tracking very closely to see what happens, whether the financial components are renewed by the 30th of September or not. And if they're not, trying to figure out why. It could be the most substantial. Hopefully it won't happen, and this is all superfluous. But if there are problems, this could usher in something that the PRC has been trying to accomplish very actively. They're trying to break the relationships with the U.S. over the COFAs, and it could change the region in the most fundamental way since the end of World War II.
As you say, a very rapidly changing environment. Cleo, thank you very much for coming on the Expert Series and sharing your insights with us.
Great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute's Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca or subscribe to our